Nearly 300 prisons around the world copied Eastern State Penitentiary, and more than 85,000 people passed through its gates. Yet America's most infamous prison was not built to be cruel. It was built as an act of mercy. Its founders believed that silence, labor, and total isolation could restore a criminal's soul. This is how their great humanitarian experiment helped give the modern world one of its most enduring forms of punishment. Before Eastern State Penitentiary became a fortress of stone, it existed as an argument. In 18th-century Philadelphia, a jail was not usually the punishment itself. It was a place where people waited. Debtors waited for someone to settle what they owed. Men and women accused of crimes waited for trial. Those already convicted waited for a sentence to be carried out. Adults and children, petty thieves, and people charged with murder could be confined inside the same building, often in common rooms where authority reached little beyond the locked door. Prisoners with money could sometimes purchase food, bedding, or a less crowded space. Those without it depended upon relatives, charity, or whatever could be obtained from other prisoners. Disease traveled easily through rooms with poor ventilation and inadequate sanitation. Violence was common, but the public saw little of it. The punishment came later, and it was meant to be seen. A person might be placed in the stocks, whipped before a crowd, branded, fined, or forced to perform hard labor in public. For the most serious offenses there was the gallows. These penalties acted upon the body and reputation. They were designed to produce pain, humiliation, and warning. The condemned person became an example for everyone gathered to watch. This was the system inherited by the generation that fought the American Revolution. After independence, however, punishment began to create an uncomfortable question. A nation claiming to be founded upon liberty and human dignity still relied upon penalties inherited from older European governments. Public cruelty could enforce the law, but it seemed poorly suited to a republic that believed individuals possessed reason and the capacity for self-government. Philadelphia stood at the center of that contradiction. The city contained the Pennsylvania State House, where the Declaration of Independence had been adopted and where delegates would soon draft the Constitution. Only a short distance away stood the Walnut Street Jail. Behind its walls, the ideals being discussed in public buildings met the conditions of actual confinement. Among those troubled by this contrast was Dr. Benjamin Rush. A physician, social reformer, and signer of the Declaration of Independence, Rush believed that criminal behavior did not always reveal a permanently corrupted character. People could be influenced by their circumstances. If destructive surroundings helped produce destructive conduct, then a carefully controlled environment might encourage different behavior. That belief was both generous and dangerous. It treated the person convicted of a crime as capable of change. It also gave the state a new ambition. Government would no longer be satisfied with restraining the body. It would attempt to reshape the mind. On May 8, 1787, Rush and other prominent Philadelphians organized the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons. Benjamin Franklin lent his name and influence to the organization. Its members included physicians, ministers, merchants, and public officials. Their title described their immediate concern plainly. They had seen what happened when people were crowded into filthy rooms, exposed to disease, exploitation, and one another. The society did not argue that convicted people should escape punishment. Its members wanted punishment to become orderly, private, and purposeful. They believed prisoners should be separated according to age, sex, and offense. They supported regular inspections, cleaner quarters, religious instruction, and limits on the arbitrary power of jailers. Most important, they began to reconsider solitude. To modern ears, solitary confinement suggests an especially severe penalty. To the reformers of the late 18th century, it could appear to be protection. Separation would prevent experienced criminals from instructing younger prisoners. It would remove intimidation and violence from the common rooms. Silence would leave a person alone with conscience, labor, and religious reflection. The criminal would not merely suffer. The criminal would become penitent. Philadelphia first tested parts of this idea at the Walnut Street Jail. In 1790, Pennsylvania authorized changes intended to classify prisoners and create a separate penitentiary section. Individual cells were constructed for certain people, while others worked under greater supervision. The state also reduced its reliance on several forms of public and corporal punishment. Imprisonment, once mainly a period of waiting, was becoming the sentence itself. For a time, Walnut Street attracted admiration. Visitors saw cleaner rooms, organized labor, and an institution that appeared more rational than the jails it was meant to replace. Reformers could point to it as evidence that punishment did not require a crowd, a whip, or a scaffold. But the old jail had not been designed for the theory now placed inside it. Its population grew. Classification became difficult to maintain. The available solitary cells could hold only a portion of those confined there. Overcrowding forced people back together, while administrators struggled to impose one system upon a building created for another purpose. The very conditions the reformers had hoped to eliminate began to return. There was another problem. Isolation required more than a locked door. If each prisoner was to live, work, eat, exercise, and reflect without contact with other prisoners, the entire institution had to be organized around separation. Corridors, cells, yards, plumbing, heating, food delivery, labor, and surveillance all had to serve the same idea. Walnut Street could be modified, it could not become that idea. After a deadly riot there in 1820, pressure for a new institution intensified. The Philadelphia Society argued that Pennsylvania needed a penitentiary designed from its foundation for individual confinement. In 1821, the state legislature approved funding for a new prison on elevated farmland northwest of Philadelphia, in an area known as Cherry Hill. The location was still beyond the dense city. The air was believed to be healthier, the ground open, and the distance sufficient to remove prisoners from the influences of urban life. Here, reformers would no longer be restricted by an inherited building. They could turn their philosophy into stone. Eastern State Penitentiary had not yet opened. Its walls had not risen, and no prisoner had passed through its gate. But the most consequential decision had already been made. Pennsylvania would build a prison not merely to hold human beings, but to change them. From Philadelphia, the new penitentiary appeared less like a place of reform than a castle prepared for siege. It stood on elevated ground approximately a mile and a half northwest of the developed city. A wall 30 feet high enclosed the property, with another 10 feet of masonry extending beneath the surface. Towers rose above the entrance. Narrow openings resembled the arrow slits of a medieval fortress, while battlements ran across the roofline. Much of this military appearance was theater. The battlements were too low to protect anyone in battle. Several of the apparent arrow slits did not pass through the wall at all. They were carved into the exterior to create an impression. The message was intended for people outside. Eastern State Penitentiary would be humane toward those confined within it, but it would present a face of severity to the surrounding world. A person considering a crime was meant to look toward Cherry Hill and see permanence, authority, and isolation. The building would perform the threatening function once served by the public scaffold, while the actual work of punishment moved beyond public view. Designing that hidden interior became the responsibility of John Haviland. Haviland was a young English-born architect who had settled in Philadelphia. Pennsylvania selected his proposal through a design competition and awarded him a prize of $100. The commission offered him an unusual opportunity. He was not being asked to arrange cells inside an ordinary building. He had to create an institution in which hundreds of people could eat, sleep, work, exercise, and receive instruction without encountering one another. The architecture had to enforce a philosophy. Haviland placed an observation center near the middle of the enclosure. From this point, 7 cell blocks would extend outward like the spokes of a wheel. An overseer standing in the center could turn and look down each corridor. Movement would pass through one controlled point, while the separate wings prevented the prison population from assembling into a single body. This arrangement was not yet the fully developed mechanical surveillance later associated with modern prisons. An officer in the center could not see directly into every cell, but the radial plan made each corridor visible and allowed a small number of employees to monitor a large institution. It turned the building itself into part of the staff. The original plan called for 7 single-story cell blocks containing approximately 256 prisoners. Each person would receive an individual cell measuring roughly 8 feet by 12 feet, with a high arched ceiling. The wooden floor and pale walls made the room appear less like a dungeon than a small chamber. At the top of the vault was a circular skylight known as the Dead Eye. It admitted daylight without offering a view of the outside world. A prisoner could see light move across the wall and floor, but not the street, the city, or another human face. The opening gave the cell a religious quality. It suggested a chapel reduced to the dimensions of one person. Every cell also had a small private exercise yard surrounded by high masonry walls. The arrangement of neighboring yards was designed to keep prisoners from seeing one another when they were outside. Exercise schedules could be staggered, preserving separation even under the open sky. Originally, the cells did not open directly into the central corridors. Meals and materials passed through small feeding holes. To enter a cell, an officer approached through the exercise yard at the rear. The corridors remained spaces of supervision rather than circulation for the prisoners. The most remarkable features were less visible. Each cell had a form of central heating, a water tap, and a cast-iron toilet that could be flushed on a schedule. Utility tunnels carried pipes beneath the cell blocks. At a time when even prosperous American homes lacked indoor plumbing, Eastern State attempted to provide water and heat to hundreds of people living in complete separation. These systems were not luxuries. They were necessary to the experiment. Prisoners at Walnut Street had survived partly through collective arrangements. They shared rooms, carried water, sought food, and negotiated with jailers and one another. At Eastern State, each of those interactions had to be removed. If a prisoner could not leave the cell to obtain water, water had to reach the cell. If a communal fire created contact, heat had to travel through pipes. If shared sanitation threatened both separation and health, waste had to be removed by an enclosed system. The prison was therefore built almost like a self-contained machine for sustaining isolated lives. Medical thinking also shaped the design. Germ theory was not yet established, and many physicians believed disease spread through foul or stagnant air. Haviland provided ventilation and individual access to an outdoor yard, partly to protect prisoners from the epidemics that had moved through older jails. Separation was expected to prevent moral contamination, while air and water would prevent physical contamination. Construction began in the early 1820s, but the scale of the project repeatedly tested the state's commitment. Stone had to be quarried, transported, cut, and assembled into walls capable of lasting for generations. Heating and plumbing systems had to be installed beneath buildings unlike any prison previously attempted. Even before completion, the original design began to bend. Pennsylvania officials wanted more capacity than the first plan allowed. The initial 3 cell blocks remained one story, but Haviland was directed to construct the remaining 4 with 2 levels. Galleries were added above the lower cells, increasing the number of people the prison could hold. This alteration solved an immediate problem while weakening the purity of the concept. The institution devoted to individual treatment was already being measured by how many individuals could be fitted inside it. By the time the original complex was completed in 1836, Eastern State covered approximately 10.5 acres within nearly half a mile of wall. Its final cost approached $780,000, making it one of the most expensive public structures of its time in the United States. The expense revealed the seriousness of the belief behind it. Pennsylvania had invested a fortune in the proposition that environment could alter conduct. Every wall, pipe, corridor, and skylight was part of that claim. Inside the Gothic exterior, the cell blocks rose with 30-foot barrel-vaulted ceilings. Light entered from above. Footsteps carried down long corridors toward the central chamber. The space possessed the proportions of a religious building, but its congregation would never gather. It was a cathedral designed for one worshipper at a time. In October 1829, while construction continued around the unfinished complex, Eastern State was ready to receive its first prisoner. The architecture had solved the physical problem of solitude. It had not yet revealed what solitude would do to the person inside. In October 1829, an 18-year-old farmer named Charles Williams passed through the gate of Eastern State Penitentiary. The institution was still under construction. Stonecutters, carpenters, and laborers continued working on buildings that would not be completed for several years. Only the earliest cell blocks were ready. Yet Pennsylvania had decided that its experiment could begin. Williams had been convicted of burglary after entering a house and stealing a watch, a gold seal, and a gold key. Together, the stolen property was valued at approximately $25. The court sentenced him to 2 years of confinement with labor. Eastern State recorded him as prisoner number 1. The admission document preserved a physical inventory. Williams was identified as a young black man with light skin, black eyes, a broad mouth, and scars on his nose and thigh. He stood 5 feet 7 inches tall. His occupation was listed as farmer, he could read. The record measured even the length of his foot. It tells us almost nothing else. It does not preserve his explanation of the burglary, his family circumstances, or what he understood about the penitentiary before arriving. It does not describe his fear, confidence, anger, or remorse. The system that claimed to address the inner life began by reducing a person to what officials could observe and classify. Under Eastern State's intake procedure, a hood was placed over a new prisoner's head. It prevented him from learning the arrangement of the building and was intended to stop other prisoners from recognizing him. Reformers argued that anonymity would protect a person after release. No former cellmate would be able to identify him on the street and expose his conviction. The hood also marked a separation from the life he had known. Williams received prison clothing and was assigned to an individual cell. Once the door closed, the architecture described in plans and legislative reports became a physical routine. The cell was not simply where he slept. It was where nearly his entire sentence would occur. He ate there, he worked there, he read there, he waited there. A typical prisoner at Eastern State spent approximately 23 hours each day inside the cell. Meals were delivered through a small opening rather than through a door facing the corridor. The original cells could be entered from the private exercise yards at the rear, allowing officers to move prisoners without bringing them into the central passage. The exercise yard offered air and daylight, but not company. Its walls were high enough to prevent a view into neighboring yards. Schedules were arranged so that adjacent prisoners would not be outside at the same time. Even under the open sky, each person remained enclosed. When prisoners had to be moved elsewhere, they wore their hoods. Bathing might occur only once every 2 or 3 weeks. A person could complete an entire sentence without clearly seeing another prisoner. Silence required constant maintenance. The thick stone walls were intended to prevent voices from passing between cells. Officers sometimes covered their shoes with soft material to reduce the sound of footsteps. Conversations were forbidden, while access to family and news from the outside world was severely restricted. In the early system, prisoners generally received no personal letters, newspapers, or ordinary visitors. The absence was deliberate. Reformers believed that communication could restore the very influences the penitentiary was designed to remove. Family members might carry news, emotion, or old loyalties into the cell. Other prisoners might exchange criminal knowledge. Newspapers could distract the mind from reflection. The institution tried to control not only what a prisoner did, but what entered his thoughts. Labor was the central exception. Idleness was considered dangerous both morally and psychologically. Prisoners made shoes, wove cloth, caned chairs, or performed other tasks that could be completed inside a cell. An overseer delivered tools and raw materials, then collected the finished work. The labor served several purposes. It helped offset the cost of confinement. It imposed routine. It also gave the prisoner something to do during hours that otherwise contained little movement or variety. Reformers believed disciplined work could create habits that would survive release. Yet work inside a solitary cell was different from work in a shop or field. It involved no conversation, cooperation, or shared rhythm. A prisoner could produce an object that would pass beyond the wall while remaining unable to follow it. Religious instruction supplied the stated meaning of the routine. A Bible was often the only book permitted. Charles Williams could read, which distinguished him from many early prisoners. For those who could not, the book intended to guide reflection remained closed in a more practical sense. Ministers, inspectors, and prison officers provided the limited human contact allowed by the system. In later years, a designated moral instructor would visit cells and record judgments about whether prisoners appeared repentant, resistant, ignorant, or beyond hope. These meetings were supposed to be personal. Each prisoner would receive attention unavailable in a crowded jail, but the relationship was never equal. The visitor could leave. The prisoner remained in the cell. Expressions of obedience or religious feeling might be sincere, strategic, or simply the language most likely to satisfy the person controlling the record. Eastern states administrators needed those records because the success of their experiment was difficult to prove. Good behavior inside the institution could mean that a person had changed. It could also mean that the walls, rules, and threat of punishment had made resistance impossible. After release, reliable tracking was limited. Photography and fingerprint identification did not yet exist. A former prisoner could change names, move to another county, or disappear into a growing city. If he committed no further known offense, officials might claim reform. If he returned, they could blame his character or the temptations waiting outside. Charles Williams completed his 2-year sentence and left Eastern State in October 1831. The prison was still unfinished. What happened to him afterward is largely absent from the surviving account. His silence continued in the archive. Other prisoners followed him through the gate. Each received a number, a cell, a work assignment, and an opportunity to become the person the reformers believed solitude could produce. From the central observation room, the institution appeared ordered. There were no crowded dormitories, no open exchange of criminal knowledge, and no public spectacle of pain. One person occupied each cell, one conscience faced itself, but the system could document compliance more easily than penitence. It could record work completed, rules broken, punishments imposed, and words spoken to an instructor. It could not reliably measure what happened during the thousands of hours when a prisoner sat alone beneath the dead eye. The building had begun its experiment with prisoner number 1. It would not be long before the silence produced evidence of a different kind. The silence at Eastern State was never complete. Prisoners learned to communicate through the architecture intended to separate them. They tapped messages against stone walls. They spoke through openings beside the heating pipes. Notes could be concealed in work materials or passed during the rare moments when movement created an opportunity. These acts were more than ordinary rule violations. To the administrators, communication threatened the theory upon which the entire institution had been built. If prisoners exchanged names, stories, or knowledge, they could influence one another. If they formed relationships beyond the approved contact of an overseer or minister, the Pennsylvania system would begin to resemble the crowded prisons it was supposed to replace. A few words through a pipe could therefore become an attack upon the institution itself. The warden's journal recorded punishments for speaking, shouting, refusing work, damaging tools, and disrupting neighboring cells. Prisoners could lose food, bedding, or access to their exercise yards. Some were placed in darkened cells on bread and water. Straitjackets and other restraints were used when officials considered a person disobedient or uncontrollable. Eastern State had been created to replace corporal punishment with reflection. Yet reflection could not be forced without discipline, and discipline gradually returned punishment to the body. The clearest early example involved Matthias Macumzi. Macumzi had been sent from Lancaster County after a conviction for manslaughter. At Eastern State, he became prisoner number 102. Records indicate that he repeatedly attempted to speak with men in neighboring cells. On June 27, 1833, Warden Samuel Wood ordered that he be placed in a straitjacket and fitted with an iron gag. The device was designed to prevent speech. An iron piece was placed across or over the tongue, while chains connected it to restraints holding the prisoner's arms behind his back. Movement increased the pressure inside the mouth. It was an instrument intended to make resistance painful. Approximately an hour later, Macumzi was found dead in his cell. The prison physician attributed the death to apoplexy, a term commonly used at the time for a sudden stroke or cerebral event. Other witnesses believed the gag had killed him. The condition of the body and the circumstances of its removal raised further questions. Testimony later suggested that employees were encouraged not to discuss what had occurred. The death became part of a broader investigation into Warden Wood's administration, including the use of punishment and the management of prison funds. The proceedings examined whether Eastern State had violated the humane principles used to justify its construction. Wood was not found guilty of cruel and unusual punishment. The investigators accepted that prison officials required some means of maintaining order, and the institution survived the scandal. The iron gag was discontinued, but the official outcome left the deeper question unresolved. If silence was considered treatment, what should happen when a prisoner refused it? The problem extended beyond deliberate resistance. Some prisoners became confused, withdrawn, agitated, or unable to work. Others shouted into the corridors, damaged their cells, or harmed themselves. Behavior that might indicate psychological collapse could also be recorded as disorder, defiance, or moral failure. Not every person entered Eastern State in good mental health. 19th-century prisons often received people who would later have been sent to psychiatric institutions, partly because few appropriate facilities existed. Early medical records cannot always show whether an illness began before admission or developed inside the cell. But isolation created conditions in which those distinctions were difficult to make. A person already vulnerable could deteriorate without sustained human contact. A person who arrived without obvious illness might begin displaying symptoms after months or years alone. The same system that made observation constant made understanding uncertain. Eastern State employed physicians and created hospital cells, but 19th-century medicine offered limited explanations for mental distress. Prison doctors acknowledged cases of insanity while often resisting the conclusion that separate confinement had caused them. Some blamed masturbation, hereditary weakness, or conditions believed to exist before imprisonment. Race entered these explanations as well. Black prisoners were disproportionately represented inside Eastern State from its earliest years. Rather than examining the courts, policing, poverty, or conditions of confinement, some physicians described black inmates as naturally more susceptible to mental illness. The claim allowed racial prejudice to operate as medical judgment. If a black prisoner deteriorated, the institution could treat the breakdown as evidence about the prisoner's nature rather than the effect of the system. The result protected Eastern State's central promise. Solitude remained curative in theory, while people who failed under it could be classified as defective exceptions. Outside the walls, the debate was becoming international. In 1831, the French commissioners Alexis de Tocqueville and Gustave de Beaumont visited American prisons while studying possible reforms for France. Eastern State offered them an institution unlike the older European jails. It was clean, organized, technologically advanced, and governed by a coherent philosophy. They understood the severity of complete solitude. They distinguished isolation with labor and controlled visits from the more absolute isolation that left a prisoner idle. Work, in their view, could provide structure and prevent the cell from becoming entirely destructive. Their report treated the Pennsylvania system seriously, but it also recognized that solitude without meaningful interruption could consume rather than reform. Other observers were less willing to accept the distinction. Charles Dickens arrived at Eastern State in 1842. He had come to the United States with particular interest in seeing the penitentiary. By then, the institution was no longer merely a state prison. It was a public argument about the limits of reform. Dickens entered cells and spoke with prisoners. He observed individuals who had difficulty maintaining conversation or directing their attention after extended isolation. What disturbed him was not the visible disorder of the old jail, but the calmness of the new one. The harm, as he understood it, occurred slowly, and left few marks that an outside visitor could immediately measure. He accepted that the founders had acted from benevolent motives. That made his conclusion more severe. The system, he wrote, was rigid and hopeless solitary confinement. I believe it, in its effects, to be cruel and wrong. Eastern State's defenders rejected the judgment. They pointed to clean cells, regular meals, work, religious instruction, and the absence of routine public whipping. Critics pointed to mental breakdown, coercive discipline, and the impossibility of proving that silence had produced repentance rather than submission. Both sides could find evidence inside the same walls. The first cracks in the Pennsylvania system did not bring it down. The prison continued to expand, and officials continued to defend separation for decades. Mackenzies' death became a scandal, but not an ending. Dickens's words became famous, but they did not open the cells. The experiment would continue with people who possessed even less power to explain what the silence was doing to them. Their names were already beginning to appear in Eastern States admission books. Some of them were children. In 1840, an 11-year-old boy named John Maxfield entered Eastern State Penitentiary. He was the youngest person identified in a surviving group of more than 1,700 early admission records. The officials who received him described him as a very small black boy. He had been convicted of setting fire to a barn and sentenced to 5 years. John denied that he was guilty. The record does not preserve a trial transcript or a detailed account of the evidence. It gives the judgment of the moral instructor instead. John was described as difficult, unintelligent, and apparently unmoved by punishment. These observations were written with the authority of an institution that believed character could be examined through conduct. At 11, John was placed inside a prison organized around adult ideas of guilt, labor, silence, and repentance. He lived in a cell built to isolate one person from every other prisoner. He worked, ate, and spent most of each day alone. His sentence covered nearly half the life he had already lived. Eastern State's founders believed young people possessed a particular capacity for reform. Their habits were not yet fixed. With instruction, discipline, and distance from destructive influences, a child might be redirected before becoming what 19th-century officials called a habitual criminal. But Pennsylvania did not offer that opportunity equally. Philadelphia already had an institution created specifically for children. The House of Refuge opened in 1826, 3 years before Eastern State. It was established for young people considered delinquent, neglected, disorderly, or in danger of entering adult criminal life. The House of Refuge was not a gentle home. Its days were highly regulated, and children could be sent there through the courts or even at the request of parents and guardians. Labor, education, religious instruction, and obedience formed the center of its program. Its administrators also believed that discipline could rebuild character. Still, it was not an adult penitentiary. A child sent to the House of Refuge entered an institution that publicly defined its mission around youth. A child sent to Eastern State entered the same system of separate confinement used for adult burglars, robbers, and people convicted of murder. Until the creation of a separate House of Refuge for colored children in 1849, The existing refuge primarily served white children. Black children accused or convicted of crimes therefore had fewer institutional alternatives. Courts could treat them as adults and send them directly into the penitentiary. There is no surviving evidence that John Maxfield personally applied to the House of Refuge and was rejected at its door. The exclusion occurred at a larger level. The city had created one path for troubled white children and failed for more than 2 decades to create an equivalent path for black children. Eastern State received the difference. Admission books kept between 1835 and 1850 identify approximately 294 prisoners under the age of 21. They ranged from 11 to 20 years old. Their offenses included larceny, arson, rioting, robbery, and murder, though property crimes brought many of them through the gate. Of those young prisoners, 146 were identified as black or by one of the many racial classifications used by officials at the time. 29 were girls. 22 of those girls were black. The imbalance becomes clearer when placed beside the population outside the walls. In the 1840 census, black residents made up roughly 3% of Pennsylvania's population. In the Eastern State records examined for the same period, they represented approximately 32% of the prison population. Among prisoners under 21, the proportion was even greater. Nearly half were black. These figures do not prove that every conviction resulted from deliberate misconduct by police, judges, or juries. They reveal something broader. Race influenced where children lived, which institutions were open to them, how poverty and disorder were policed, and whether a young defendant was understood as a child in need of redirection or a criminal ready for the penitentiary. The classification continued inside the prison. Moral instructors visited the cells, taught religion, evaluated conduct, and recorded judgments about the future of each prisoner. Their notes are valuable because they preserve information that would otherwise have disappeared. They are also documents of institutional power. A prisoner could be labeled repentant, resistant, ignorant, promising, or hopeless. The instructor interpreted silence, emotion, religious language, and obedience through his own beliefs. A young person who distrusted authority might appear hardened. A frightened child might appear indifferent. A prisoner who learned what the instructor wanted to hear might be recorded as reformed. For prisoners 21 and older, the moral instructor judged approximately 45% to have no hope of improvement. Among those under 21, the proportion marked as having no hope rose to approximately 64%. The people believed to be most capable of reform were often judged most harshly. John Maxfield's first record ended with a small degree of optimism. Despite the negative language used to describe him, the instructor noted some hope of change. During his imprisonment, John learned to read. That achievement represented exactly the sort of improvement Eastern State claimed it could produce. He was released in August 1845 after completing his 5-year sentence. 13 months later, John returned. He was now 17 and had been convicted of stealing a gun valued at $6. The second sentence was 1 year. His new record mentioned that his mother was alive, that he had received no religious education or Sunday school instruction before prison, and that he had learned to read during his first confinement. It also referred to misconduct during his earlier sentence, including an attempt to set fire inside the penitentiary. Whether this reflected anger, desperation, or a continuing attraction to fire cannot be determined from the surviving entry. This time, the moral instructor reached a different conclusion. John Maxfield was marked as having no hope. The phrase closed the institutional account of a boy whom Eastern State had confined from age 11 to 16, released, and then received again. His return could be treated as evidence that his character had resisted reform. It could also be read as evidence that 5 years of isolation had not prepared a child for life outside the gate. Another young prisoner, 16-year-old Elizabeth Harris, exposed the limits of the process more directly. She entered Eastern State in July 1846 with a 3-year sentence for larceny. The moral instructor recorded his belief that she was innocent. According to his note, a lawyer had advised her to confess, suggesting that doing so would prevent conviction. She followed the advice and was sentenced anyway. That private doubt did not release her. Elizabeth died at Eastern State in February 1847, less than 7 months after admission. The final notation suggested that her mind may have been affected. Her file ended where the institution's authority ended, with an observation, not a remedy. John Maxfield and Elizabeth Harris were not famous prisoners. Their cells did not become attractions, and their names were largely absent from the popular legends that later surrounded Eastern State. What remains of them is handwriting in admission books created by the people who confined them. Those pages reveal a failure deeper than overcrowding or cruel discipline. Eastern State promised to treat each prisoner as an individual soul capable of change. But the road to its cells had already been divided by race, age, poverty, and access to other institutions. Inside the walls, each child received an individual cell. Outside them, they had never received an equal choice. By the middle of the 19th century, Eastern State Penitentiary faced a problem that architecture could not solve. More people were being sent through its gate. Philadelphia and the surrounding counties were growing. Immigration changed the population of the city, while industrialization produced new neighborhoods, new forms of poverty, and a larger system of policing and courts. Eastern State's admission books increasingly recorded Irish and German prisoners, followed later by people from Italy and Eastern Europe. The penitentiary had been designed around a simple equation. One prisoner required one cell. That principle made Eastern State different from nearly every older jail. It was also the source of its growing weakness. In a common prison room, another person could be added with a mattress or a space on the floor. Under the Pennsylvania system, an additional prisoner required a separate chamber, an exercise yard, ventilation, heat, plumbing, work materials, and a schedule preventing contact with anyone nearby. Separation could not be improvised cheaply. The pressure had already changed John Haviland's original design during construction. The first cell blocks were one story, but later blocks received upper galleries to increase capacity. As the population continued to rise, administrators found new ways to place more people within the original walls. Some alterations appeared minor. During the 1850s, doors were cut through the fronts of cells that had originally been accessible only from the private yards behind them. This allowed officers to enter directly from the corridors. It made daily operations faster and gave staff easier access when prisoners were ill, uncooperative, or in danger. It also changed the meaning of the corridor. Haviland had designed the central passages primarily for observation and service. A prisoner remained sealed behind masonry, receiving meals through a small opening. With the addition of doors, the cell blocks began to resemble more conventional prisons. Iron gates and visible entrances replaced part of the original enclosure. The change made Eastern State easier to manage while weakening the separation it had been built to enforce. The prisoners contributed to that weakening themselves. They continued speaking through pipes, tapping walls and passing notes. Some damaged their equipment or refused assigned labor. Others learned enough about the institution's routines to communicate during bathing, medical treatment, or movement between cells. Complete isolation existed more securely in official descriptions than in daily life. Economics created another pressure. At Eastern State, prisoners performed trades that could be practiced in a cell. They made shoes, wove fabric, constructed furniture, and caned chairs. The work occupied time and produced goods that could be sold, but the arrangement placed strict limits on scale. Large machinery could not be installed in an individual cell. Skilled instruction had to be delivered one person at a time or in tightly controlled encounters. Materials had to move from workshops or storerooms into hundreds of separate rooms, then return as completed products. The architecture that prevented communication also prevented efficient production. New York offered a competing model. Under the Auburn system, prisoners slept alone at night but worked together during the day in large workshops. They remained under a rule of silence and marched in tightly controlled formations. Corporal punishment was commonly used to enforce obedience. Auburn was not necessarily more humane, it was more economical. Contractors could organize prison labor in factory-like conditions. Groups of prisoners could operate machinery, receive instruction together, and produce goods in larger quantities. The revenue helped reduce the apparent cost to the state. For American legislatures facing growing prison populations, that advantage mattered. Throughout much of the United States, the Auburn model became more influential than the strict separation practiced at Eastern State. States could adopt the language of discipline and reform without constructing a private workplace and exercise yard for every person they confined. Pennsylvania continued defending its own system. Supporters argued that congregate labor exposed prisoners to corrupting influences and treated them as units of production. Eastern State, they maintained, still addressed the individual. Its higher expense was the price of preventing contamination between prisoners. But that defense became harder to sustain as the institution compromised its own rules. By the 1860s, more than one prisoner could be placed in a cell. Officials sometimes described the arrangement as temporary or necessary, but a shared cell struck at the center of the Pennsylvania system. Two people confined together could speak, exchange histories, and form alliances. The influence that Eastern State had spent a fortune preventing now occurred inside the space designed for reflection. By the 1870s, approximately half the prisoners at Eastern State lived with a cellmate. Administrators responded by constructing additional cell blocks in the open spaces between Haviland's original 7 spokes. The additions increased capacity but disrupted the clarity of the radial plan. Some new corridors could not be fully observed from the center. Buildings, workshops, and service areas occupied ground once left open for light, ventilation, and separation. The prison survived by becoming less like itself. Yet while the Pennsylvania system weakened in Philadelphia, its reputation continued traveling abroad. Architects, government commissioners, and reformers crossed the Atlantic to study Eastern State. They examined its radial arrangement, individual cells, plumbing, heating, ventilation, and methods of surveillance. Prisons influenced by Eastern State appeared across Europe, Asia, Latin America, and the European colonial world. More than 300 institutions on several continents would eventually be associated with its design or philosophy. Not all of them copied the entire system. Some adopted the radiating cell blocks without maintaining permanent isolation. Others used separate cells only for certain prisoners or portions of a sentence. The architectural form proved more adaptable than the moral theory that had produced it. This was Eastern State's most enduring achievement. The Pennsylvania system did not become the dominant model in the United States. Its cost, inflexibility, and effects upon prisoners made strict separation increasingly difficult to defend. But Haviland's plan demonstrated how architecture could organize surveillance, movement, classification, and control. Even where solitude was rejected, the building remained useful. By the opening years of the 20th century, Eastern States still used the language of separate confinement, but the original practice had become largely impossible. Prisoners shared cells. They encountered one another during work and movement. The institution had accumulated additions that Haviland could not have anticipated. The dead eye remained above many cells, but it no longer illuminated a world containing only one prisoner. In 1913, Pennsylvania officially abandoned the separate system at Eastern State. The declaration did not cause a sudden transformation. It acknowledged one that had been occurring for decades. Prisoners could now gather for work, meals, exercise, and religious services. Individual yards were converted for other uses. Corridors, once defined by silence, began to carry conversation, orders, arguments, and the ordinary noise of a large prison population. The institution did not close when its founding principle ended. Its walls were too valuable, its cells too numerous, and the demand for confinement too great. Eastern State had outlived the promise that created it. It would now have to discover what kind of prison it had become. When Eastern State abandoned the Pennsylvania system in 1913, sound returned to the cell blocks. Prisoners spoke in the corridors, gathered for work, attended religious services, and exercised together. The individual yards that had once protected separation were opened, combined, or converted to other uses. Workshops occupied spaces designed for solitude. Baseball and football appeared inside the walls, and Italian prisoners brought bacchi to the yards. Eastern State began to function like a city contained within a fortress. There were kitchens, a bakery, a hospital, a library, workshops, barbershops, and places of worship. Men repaired plumbing, painted walls, prepared meals, printed documents, and maintained the aging machinery of the institution. The prison depended upon their labor because the original complex required constant attention. The social life inside reflected divisions outside. Prisoners were separated by race in housing and employment. Black prisoners were often assigned less desirable work, while positions requiring specialized training tended to go to white prisoners. Religious identity also shaped daily organization. Protestant and Catholic services were joined by Jewish worship, and a synagogue was formally dedicated in 1929. Women remained part of Eastern State until 1923. They had been confined there for 92 years, usually in small numbers, and under the supervision of a matron. Some gave birth inside the prison. Others raised young children there for a time because no suitable arrangement existed beyond the walls. The last female prisoner was Freda Trost, convicted of poisoning her husband. She and the remaining women were transferred to the new state institution at Muncie. Eastern State became an all-male prison, but removing a small group of women did little to relieve its central problem. The prison was full. Designed for approximately 250 people, Eastern State held close to 1,700 at its peak in the middle of the 1920s. Cell blocks had been inserted between Haviland's original spokes until open ground became increasingly scarce. Cells intended for one person held two or more. Corridors that had once been silent became crowded routes for movement, work, and recreation. The center could no longer see everything. Some of the newer cell blocks curved around existing structures or stood beyond a clear line of sight from the central observation point. Gates were added to contain groups during disturbances. The prison increased its capacity by sacrificing the architectural order that had made it famous. Yet the public rarely remembered Eastern State through overcrowding or maintenance reports. Its reputation gathered around particular names. One of the first was not a man. In 1924, a black Labrador retriever named Pep arrived at the prison and was photographed with an identification number. Newspapers and later storytellers claimed that Pennsylvania Governor Gifford Pinchot had sentenced the dog to life for killing his wife's cat. The story survived because it offered the perfect prison legend: an official photograph, an inmate number, a severe governor, and a guilty-looking dog. Correspondents discovered years later provided a different explanation. Pinchot had read that the governor of Maine donated a dog to a prison and asked Eastern State's warden whether he would like one as well. The warden agreed, believing the animal would improve morale. Pep was not a convicted murderer. He was a prison pet turned into a prisoner by the story told about him. A more consequential legend entered 5 years later. In May 1929, Philadelphia police arrested Al Capone and his bodyguard, Frank Klein, after finding loaded, unlicensed revolvers in their possession. Within approximately 12 hours, both men had received the maximum sentence of 1 year for carrying concealed weapons. Capone was already one of the most recognizable gangsters in the United States. His arrival brought reporters to a prison whose national fame had faded since the 19th century. Newspapers described his cell as an apartment of unusual comfort, furnished with paintings, a polished desk, a lamp, an oriental rug, and a powerful radio playing music. Eastern State appeared to have placed one of America's most powerful criminals in a private room. The truth is less certain. Contemporary reports support the presence of furnishings and a radio, but later records suggest that such items may not have been entirely unique. Capone apparently purchased the radio from the previous occupant, and at least one document refers to him having a cellmate. The precise cell he occupied is also uncertain. Capone probably received advantages unavailable to many prisoners. The image of uninterrupted luxury was also useful to newspapers selling a story about privilege, crime, and corruption. The surviving evidence places the truth somewhere between an ordinary cell and the private suite of popular memory. While attention remained on Capone, Pennsylvania was constructing an answer to Eastern states' overcrowding. In 1929, the State Correctional Institution at Graterford opened as Eastern States Farm Branch, adding approximately 3,500 beds to the prison network. Graterford offered space and newer facilities, but it did not restore Eastern State. The old prison remained in service, holding men within a complex whose original design had been buried under nearly a century of additions. In 1933, prisoners rioted and set fire to cells while protesting overcrowding and inadequate recreation. The disturbance showed how completely Eastern State had changed. Violence in the early penitentiary had usually involved one prisoner and an officer. Now administrators faced organized groups capable of controlling parts of the institution. The prison responded with more gates, more barriers, and stricter security. Its most famous escape came on April 3, 1945. For nearly a year, a prisoner named Clarence Kleindienst had worked from his cell in Cell Block 7. Trusted for his ability to repair plaster and stone, he received permission to replaster his own walls. Behind a wooden panel, he concealed the entrance to a tunnel. The passage descended approximately 15 feet, extended 97 feet beneath the wall toward Fairmount Avenue, and then rose 15 feet to the surface. It had wooden supports and electric lighting. Kleindienst possessed the practical knowledge, tools, and access required to work without immediate suspicion. 12 prisoners used the tunnel. Among them was bank robber and escape artist Willie Sutton. Sutton later received much of the public credit for the plan, but the tunnel belonged primarily to Kleindienst's labor and preparation. Sutton emerged muddy onto the street and was captured within minutes, only 2 blocks from the prison. Kleindienst remained free for approximately 2 hours. One escapee, James Grace, returned 8 days later. Hungry and unable to remain hidden, he rang the prison bell and asked to be admitted. All 12 men were eventually recaptured. Eastern State filled the tunnel with ash, repaired the cell, and continued operating. The escape entered legend because of Sutton's name. The deeper significance lay in how it occurred. A prisoner used the work required to maintain the old building to pass beneath its wall. By 1945, Eastern State was no longer an experiment in penitence. It was an overcrowded maximum security prison held together by gates, repairs, routines, and the labor of the people confined inside it. The legends made the institution appear larger than life. The aging stone behind them was becoming increasingly difficult to control. Eastern State Penitentiary had been built beyond the edge of Philadelphia. By the middle of the 20th century, Philadelphia had reached every wall. Houses, businesses, schools, churches, and neighborhood streets surrounded the prison. Fairmount Avenue passed directly in front of the gate. A person escaping from Eastern State no longer emerged into open farmland. He entered a populated city. The location changed the meaning of every security failure. Inside, the institution carried the weight of more than a century of construction. Original stone cell blocks stood beside later buildings made from brick, steel, and concrete. Some corridors extended directly from Haviland's center. Others curved around workshops and additions that blocked the original lines of sight. Plumbing leaked. Electrical systems aged. Plaster separated from damp walls. Roofs required continual repair. Prisoners worked as painters, electricians, plumbers, and maintenance laborers because something was always failing. Former prisoners did not remember Eastern State as uniformly violent. Some called it the house and described a more settled population than existed in other prisons. They played chess, watched scheduled television programs, worked assigned jobs, and formed cautious relationships with guards. But the relative calm depended upon a building increasingly unsuited to the people it held. By 1940, Eastern State was operating as a maximum security prison. Men serving life sentences lived in cells constructed when most terms had lasted only a few years. Prisoners condemned to death waited inside walls designed a century before modern death row. The institution responded by building barriers within barriers. Beneath one section of the prison were punishment cells known collectively as the Hole or Klondike. They were small, low, and without plumbing. Prisoners sent there could lose their mattresses, blankets, regular meals, reading material, and access to light. Terms in Klondike might last from 10 to 30 days. Former prisoners recalled men receiving bread and water or diminishing portions of food. One remembered a friend emerging after 30 days with his eyesight badly affected by the darkness. Isolation had completed its transformation. In 1829, solitude had been the treatment offered to every prisoner. By the 20th century, ordinary prison life included work, conversation, recreation, and communal movement. Solitude remained, but now it was reserved as punishment for people who violated the rules. The same condition, once described as an opportunity for repentance, had become punishment within punishment. Eastern State's last major construction project made that division permanent. Cell Block 15 was completed in 1959. Unlike the vaulted 19th century corridors, it had electrically controlled doors and a central safety passage intended to separate officers from prisoners. It was a prison inside the prison. The men held there included those considered especially dangerous, those serving severe disciplinary penalties, and prisoners awaiting execution. Privileges could be sharply restricted. Former inmates recalled dim cells, little reading material, limited visitation, and reduced meals. No execution occurred at Eastern State. When the date approached, condemned prisoners were transferred to the State Correctional Institution at Rockview, where Pennsylvania carried out death sentences. Eastern State held the waiting. Cell Block 15 was the most modern section of the institution, but its completion revealed the failure of the larger building. After more than a century of additions, Pennsylvania had constructed a new high-security prison block inside a penitentiary that could no longer provide reliable security as a whole. Administrators installed gates at the ends of cell blocks to contain disturbances. Officers working inside did not always carry keys to those barriers. The policy was intended to prevent prisoners from taking control of the locks, but it meant guards could become trapped inside a block with the men they supervised. On the evening of January 8, 1961, that vulnerability became visible. The disturbance began in Cell Block 9. A prisoner named John Klausenberg told an officer that he wanted to retrieve a guitar from another inmate. When the cell was opened, Klausenberg and an accomplice overpowered the officer and began releasing other prisoners. The movement spread beyond a single corridor. Dozens of men gained access to several cell blocks. 8 officers were taken hostage, and 2 were stabbed with improvised weapons. Prisoners entered the records room and set it on fire, attempting to destroy the files that documented their convictions and sentences. Smoke moved through corridors built to carry light and air. The central observation point could no longer contain what was happening around it. Eastern State had prepared a response plan called Operation Prison Breakout. Police and firefighters established a perimeter extending 6 blocks around the prison. State troopers and correctional officers entered with tear gas and clubs, moving through the institution one cell block at a time. They retook the prison. The riot caused extensive damage and numerous injuries, but no deaths. The absence of fatalities did not make the event a narrow escape. It showed how quickly a failure inside Eastern State could become an emergency for the neighborhood beyond its walls. A state investigation followed. The Pennsylvania Attorney General recommended that the penitentiary be closed as soon as possible. The old prison was described in 3 terms: obsolete, vulnerable, and dangerous to everyone living in the city. Yet Eastern State did not close immediately. Pennsylvania still needed prison beds. Replacing a large institution required money, construction, transportation, and space elsewhere in the correctional system. The building had outlasted its philosophy because the state needed its cells. It now outlasted an official warning for the same reason. For nearly another decade, prisoners and employees continued moving through corridors that the state had already judged unsafe. Maintenance crews kept the utilities functioning. Officers watched gates that had been installed to compensate for older gates. The prison remained open through routine, necessity, and the difficulty of admitting that a massive public institution had reached its end. In January 1970, Pennsylvania ceased operating Eastern State as a state penitentiary. Most of its remaining prisoners were transferred to Graterford and other facilities. The building was 141 years old. Its use was not quite over. After a riot at Philadelphia's Holmesburg prison, the city briefly reopened Eastern State in 1971 to hold displaced prisoners. Men returned to the cells for a final period, not because the building had been repaired, but because another prison had failed. When they left, Eastern State stood empty. More than 85,000 people had passed through its gate since Charles Williams entered in 1829. The corridors that once enforced silence, then filled with the noise of a congregate prison, became quiet again. This time, the silence was not part of a theory. The state had abandoned the building. What remained was a half-mile of wall enclosing an institution Philadelphia no longer knew whether to preserve, reuse, or erase. After the last prisoners left in 1971, Eastern State Penitentiary began to open itself to the weather. Water entered through damaged roofs. Winter froze moisture inside the masonry, widening cracks and loosening plaster. Wooden floors softened and collapsed, metal rusted. Plants took root in courtyards, gutters, and abandoned cells. The Philadelphia Streets Department used parts of the property for storage, but no agency maintained the complex as a functioning building. Vandals entered. Objects disappeared. Trees grew from places where prisoners had once exercised beneath carefully controlled sections of sky. A colony of stray cats settled inside the walls. Eastern State had been designated a National Historic Landmark in 1965 while it was still operating. The designation recognized its importance to prison architecture and penal history, but recognition did not provide a clear future. The property covered valuable land in a neighborhood that no longer resembled the rural Cherry Hill of 1829. To some city officials, the walls enclosed an opportunity. In the 1980s, redevelopment proposals considered using the site for apartments, commercial space, or a shopping center. Some plans would have preserved portions of the Gothic exterior while replacing much of what stood behind it. The facade could survive as decoration. That possibility carried an uncomfortable historical symmetry. Eastern State's false arrow slits and shallow battlements had always been a performance. They created the appearance of a medieval fortress while concealing a modern institution. A redevelopment project could preserve the same mask while removing the cells, corridors, hospital, workshops, and punishment spaces that gave the walls their meaning. Architects, historians, preservationists, and neighborhood residents organized to prevent that outcome. They formed a task force and argued that Eastern State should be treated as evidence rather than available land. In 1988, Philadelphia Mayor Wilson Goode halted the effort to sell the property. The decision did not solve the practical problem. Eastern State contained 15 cell blocks and more than a century of accumulated construction. Restoring the entire complex would require enormous funding and force another difficult choice. Which Eastern State should be restored? There was the unfinished penitentiary of Charles Williams, with individual cells and private yards. There was the expanding 19th century institution that confined John Maxfield and hundreds of other children. There was the congregate prison of sports fields, workshops, women, and religious communities. There was the overcrowded maximum security facility of Al Capone, Clarence Clindenst, and the riot of 1961. Returning the building to one period would require removing evidence of the others. The preservation team chose a different approach. Eastern State would become a stabilized ruin. Roofs, walls, and walkways would be secured where necessary, but much of the decay would remain visible. Selected spaces could be restored to explain specific periods, while the larger complex would retain the layers left by 142 years of confinement. The damage became part of the archive. In 1994, Eastern State welcomed approximately 10,000 people during its first season of public hard hat tours. Visitors entered corridors where plants still grew through broken floors and plaster lay beneath the dead eyes. They could see how later doors had been cut into early cells, how new blocks crowded Haviland's radial plan, and how modern concrete stood beside 19th-century stone. The prison's ruined appearance also created another identity. Filmmakers, photographers, musicians, and television producers used Eastern State as a ready-made image of abandonment and institutional dread. Stories of ghosts became inseparable from its public reputation. Darkness, empty cells, and flaking walls allowed the prison to be presented as a place outside ordinary time. There was a risk in that image. A haunted building can become frightening without requiring the audience to understand who was confined there, why they were sent, or what the institution believed it was doing. Supernatural stories can turn documented suffering into atmosphere. Eastern State's deeper history does not require ghosts. Matthias Macumzi died after being placed in an iron gag. Elizabeth Harris died while serving a sentence the moral instructor himself believed unjust. John Maxfield entered at 11 and spent 5 years inside a system built for adult penitents. These lives are incomplete in the record, but their incompleteness is part of what the prison reveals. Administrators documented bodies, crimes, conduct, labor, illness, race, and religious instruction. They were less successful at preserving the voices of the people they judged. Modern research has begun to reverse that perspective. Admission books can be examined across thousands of entries rather than read only as isolated files. Patterns hidden from earlier histories become visible. The overrepresentation of black prisoners, the confinement of children, the presence of women, and the subjective language used to declare someone promising or hopeless. The ruin now watches the archive being reopened. It also stands within a country that did not leave Eastern State's ideas behind. In the decades after the prison closed, incarceration expanded dramatically across the United States. New institutions abandoned Haviland's Gothic style, but they retained architecture organized around surveillance, classification, restricted movement, and controlled contact. Solitary confinement survived without the original promise of penitence. It became a method of discipline, protection, administration, and punishment. The religious language faded. The locked cell remained. Racial inequality also extended beyond Eastern State's closing. Charles Williams was the prison's first inmate, and black prisoners remained disproportionately represented throughout its operating history. The same pattern continued within the larger criminal justice system after the gate closed. Eastern State did not cause all of these developments. Its importance lies in how clearly it brings them together. The building shows that institutions can begin with sincere reformers and still produce suffering. It shows that replacing visible cruelty with private control does not guarantee humanity. It shows how an experimental practice can fail in one place while its architecture and assumptions travel far beyond it. The founders wanted to look past the crime and recover the person. Yet the institution they created often saw a number, a category, a diagnosis, or a disciplinary problem first. Today, the direction of observation has changed. Visitors stand in the central chamber where officers once watched the cell blocks. They look into rooms designed to prevent prisoners from looking out. Light still enters through the circular skylights, crossing damaged walls and empty floors. The dead eye remains open. Eastern State Penitentiary is no longer America's most important prison because of Al Capone, Willie Sutton, or the legends attached to its ruins. It matters because the building preserves the distance between an intention and its consequences. It began as an effort to replace cruelty with mercy. It became a machine for silence, then a crowded city, then an obsolete fortress, and finally a ruin through which the country can examine the system it built. The prison stopped watching its inmates in 1971. It has been watching America ever since.